I'm Jack Carlson, more known as Big Planes on YouTube, and this is my custom LEGO B-52 Stratofortress from Vietnam. So this would have served in the 7th Bomb Wing during the Vietnam War. This was the B-52 tail number 677, so 50677, titled the City of Fort Worth. That's the livery for this one. And this one has some history behind it. It was, I believe, the first B-52 delivered to Carswell Air Force Base all the way back in 1958. So this is an old one. This is one of the older B-52s, and I have it currently depicted in the camouflage pattern that it would have been when it was deployed to Vietnam. So this B-52 would have been used probably later in the war because the F models were used earlier in the war. This one would have been used on missions such as Linebacker 2 and other assorted carpet bombing missions, and I wanted to build something that would be memorable because the B-52 can be built in a few different liveries. It can be either built in all white on the bottom and gray on the top, or the more modern livery, which is all gray. But I wanted to do one that was just a little more interesting, where the colors popped a little more.
Yeah, it's always nice to have a cool camo pattern versus just the all gray, what I call Star Wars look for things.
Yep. Yeah, I wanted something a little different because a good friend of mine, Ralph Sevelsberg, has already made an all-gray one. So I'm like, all right, I got to do something different. So I decided to go with camouflage, and there were some challenges involved with doing that. That a lot of work had to be done behind the scenes that you didn't get to see when I was building this. When it comes to sourcing the parts, I had to go to like foreign countries, not physically, but I had to order parts from foreign countries to be able to actually build the thing, because there's some pieces that aren't really available in these colors that you think would be but aren't, or they're really hard to get and very expensive. For instance, the 1x6 sand green tiles, for some reason those are just really hard to come across, and I needed a lot of them for the engines and the fuel tanks and all that. So yeah, that was tricky, but at the end of the day I was able to source all the correct color parts, and it ended up looking really nice.
Yeah. And what was the source material in terms of photos and stuff like for this? I see you've got some books and things laid out here.
Oh yeah, so initially, I knew I wanted to make a D model going into this project because I had seen that one in person in multiple museums, and I'd seen pictures of it, and I just knew that it was a much nicer looking airplane than the other ones. But much past that, I sort of struggled to find good source material. You can see this book right here, and give a little bit of time with the camera to come on over. This book here has some great reference material on the B-52 in general, but also the D. See if I can find it here. A lot of pictures in black and white, such as the actual missions from the Vietnam War, and you can see a great picture of the engines here. These are the earlier turbojet engines. There's some funny stories behind this. We actually have a couple guys here at BrickFair that used to fly B-52s, and they could tell you all about the engines and how reliable they were, and these engines specifically these engines on the B-52D were water-injected turbojet engines. So for those of you who are not really that in tune with aviation, what that basically means is they have to inject water into the engine fuel mix during takeoff, so to get extra power so it could actually get in the air. So these things would be trailing massive trails of black smoke during takeoff, which I think we might be able to find a picture of it here. Don't quote me on that, but for sure, see if I can find it.
You see a little bit.
Oh yeah,
here.
It's here. There's the classic picture. I'm sure you could find it of a B-52 trailing black smoke, and modern B-52s also do the same thing where they trail black smoke. I don't think I'm going to be able to find it, but suffice it to say, these are not the cleanest aircraft, but you have to remember they were designed 70 years ago, and the U.S. Air Force plans on keeping them in active duty service until at least 2040, if not greater. So 100 years of active duty military service. So that's pretty good for an aircraft that was designed really in the early 1950s.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So tell us a little bit more about the model itself. How wide is the wingspan? Do you know how many pieces are in this?
Yeah, so the wingspan is about 5 feet wide, and the length is about 4 feet long. So it's not the biggest thing I've done, but it is pretty big for a military.
Still very sizable.
Still big for a military aircraft, for sure. And I could never usually 100% know how many parts are in it, but I'm guessing that there's probably around 15,000 based on the amount of orders I had to make and how much it weighs. That's how I usually figure out how many parts are in it. And it worked pretty well. Usually there's an algorithm you can put it into, like plug this number to that, and you can get a rough estimate. Again, it's not super scientific, but it works. And this one in particular has all the features that you would normally expect. A lot of them are kind of hard to demonstrate, although maybe later in the show I'll pick it up so you can see it. But it has functioning landing gear. The landing gear on this thing are very weird. They are not conventional. They fold forward and back into the aircraft. They're a bicycle landing gear. And the reason for that is because the wing is super thin. So the engineers had to put the landing gear somewhere else. So they opted to put it into the fuselage, a lot like they did with the predecessor to this, the Boeing B-52 Stratojet. So that was one of the defining characteristics of the B-52 is the thin, flexible wing, as well as the very weird undercarriage setup where you have the landing gear folding both forward and back.
And you see how thin and flexible the wing is here as it kind of slopes down to the sides.
Oh yeah, so in fact it was so flexible that they had put outrigger wheels at the tips of the wings because otherwise the tips and the fuel tanks would strike the ground. And it really depended on how much fuel was in the plane and whether it was under lift, because when this thing got in the air, the wings would flex up quite a bit. So there's a lot of movement within the wings. I'm a little bit amazed that the airframe has held up over these last 70 years, but the Air Force has done a very good job of keeping them in shape, so that's really good. And in comparison to a modern passenger plane, this thing, or when I built it, was about 9 studs wide, which is pretty close to 9 feet wide. And your average narrow-body passenger plane, like a 737, is 12 feet wide, or like 12 studs wide in LEGO terms. So this is not even that big fuselage wide compared to a modern passenger jet, whereas the wingspan on this thing is absolutely massive. So that poses its own unique, risks when it comes to structural integrity within the plane.
You got bigger wings attached to a smaller base there.
Yes, exactly, which was a little bit tricky when I was trying to get the wing carry-through structure to work out because I didn't want the wings to just snap off. It's okay to have a little bit of sag, but you don't want them to just snap right off when you move it. So that was very difficult to get right, and I can pick the model up. It's not very easy, it's very heavy, but it is somewhat swooshable, so that's...
Can you demonstrate that for us right now, or is that too dangerous?
I could probably demonstrate it. Let's see.
That would be awesome.
Let's see if I can do this without knocking anything over. I'm gonna actually flip it over so you can see the underside. All the flap structure and... So yeah, you can see it's very mildly swooshable. Your arms will get tired after a little bit. And this is a great view to show the bomb bays on the bottom. Right now they are closed, but normally, I'm see if I can open it with my finger here. You can see that they would open. And there are 2 doors actually on these bomb bays. There's one door on the outside and one door that opens up even wider so you can load munitions on the ground. So that's very interesting. You can also see, unfortunately, both my hands are kind of occupied right now, but I would show you how the landing gear works. Maybe when I'm packing this up, you guys could come back around and just get a quick view of that. But yeah, so that's the bottom. The bottom would have been painted in black because this would have been used during nighttime raids. So you would have wanted the top painted in camouflage and the bottom painted in black. So I'm gonna set this down because it's getting kind of heavy. But yeah, it's swooshable. The wings don't snap off, and that's how that works. So
Fantastic! I love it. Thank you so much for picking that up and showing some of the features on the bottom there.
Crushed our crew, but that's all right. They're made out of plastic, so.
I was going to ask you about the crew. How many people would typically serve on these at a time?
Yeah, so I believe there would be 6 people on this.
So not that many then.
No, so let's see if I can get this right. I know somebody in the comment section is probably going to correct me on this because there were different variations depending on the variant of the model, but you'd, at least in all cases, you'd have a pilot and a co-pilot or first officer. You would have a couple of radar navigators or radar and navigators that would be in the lower deck, and you would also have an electronic warfare officer who would be up here, and then you would have a gunner position, at least in the earlier model B-52s. So this one, the gunner was actually in the back of the plane in this really funky looking tail turret. It had 450 caliber machine guns, and it was radar guided, but he would be all the way back in his own pressurized compartment in the back of the plane. And I can show you actually up here when he's able to get the camera around, so I want to give him ample time to do that. We actually do have ejection seats, so this was something that I look forward to. You can see that each one of these could pop off. See if I can get this one to come off. Let's see. There we go. So you can see those are the pilot and co-pilot, or first officer, depending on your terminology. And then a little bit further back, you can see we have, this would be the, don't quote me on this, the electronic warfare officer, I'm pretty sure. So he would be stationed here. In later B-52 models, the gunner was moved forward. So right now there's only one guy here because the gunner is in the back of the plane, but in later models, when the gunner position became completely remote, they moved him up here towards the front. And in the most recent B-52, they just eliminated the gunner altogether because the reality with this is you wouldn't really be encountering targets using machine guns. Most things were missiles, and these planes would usually go in after the threat was eliminated to carpet bombs, so that really became kind of obsolete, the turret. And underneath the plane, I'm going to see if I could do this, there are two more ejection seats. Now these ejection seats are a little bit controversial. You can see that the bottom would pop out, then the seat would fly out like this. There's two of these that comes out on either side, and the problem with these, and you might be able to figure this out, is that they're downward firing ejection seats. Now, initially the B-52 was used in a high altitude bombing role as a nuclear bomber. It was our main deterrent in the 1950s and 60s. But as surface-to-air missiles got better and as ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, got better, the B-52 really wasn't that useful in a high-altitude role anymore. So going into Vietnam and even before that, they were transitioned to low-altitude bombing roles with conventional explosives. The problem being, when you're at low altitude, your downward-firing ejection seat no longer is such a great idea now, is it? Because if you were under here, unfortunately, you would get launched into the ground at high speeds, and it was not a good situation to be in, especially during takeoff and landing emergencies. You would not want to be in the lower ejection seat positions. So that is something that, in hindsight, probably wasn't the greatest design move, but it sort of had to be done because the B-52 did not have a lot of room width-wise to add more seats. So that is something that's very interesting when it comes to the design. Something else that's interesting is this is a Vietnam-era B-52, so this would not have been used as a nuclear bomber. This would have been used as a conventional bomber, so dropping dummy bombs pretty much. And you can see under the wing pylons, I have 500-pound just dumb bombs. And there would have been a ton more in the bomb bay. I haven't put any in there now because nobody could see that really, but this B-52 would have been outfitted with what's called a big belly modification, where the entire bomb bay could have been filled with just dumb bombs, basically, to just get as much in there as they can. And I decided to pick this with 24 of the 500-pound bombs under the wings on pylons. This is what they would have done to increase the load. And I decided to build these out of old dark gray because I thought that was the closest color I could get to olive drab. And I think it turned out looking pretty good. So I'm happy how that works. And one more thing I'll touch on the functionality of the plane, I guess, is the trailing edge surfaces. So the flaps here, there are flaps, and I put flapper-ons, I believe that's what those are called. See, the flaps are Fowler flaps, if I can get this to work correctly. Like this. Oh, I gotta go like this, there we go. We'll go with this one. Because when the wing flexes, it doesn't want to work as well. So you can see that goes, and then this comes in like that. And then see if this one will work. There we go, okay. So maybe I just had to do that one first. But that's what it looks like when all the flaps are in, and this is what it looks like when they are extended. And that was a tricky thing to get in there because the wing's very thin and the flaps need to slide first since they're a Fowler flap. So that was a little bit tricky, especially when I have to contend with the engines being mounted and the fuel tanks being mounted to the wings. So all in all, I'm glad it worked out, and I'm glad I was able to carry the camouflage pattern all the way through to the wing.
No, I mean, it's a fantastic looking model. So you mentioned kind of the gunner seats back there on the older models like this one. Yeah. Are there reports and stories of actually having kind of like dogfights in the sky between this and like enemy aircraft, or was that just there as a precaution?
I don't think they were used super often, but I do believe there are cases where they did shoot down enemy aircraft. I'm not sure on an exact number, but I know that they were used. Okay. Now, later on, when it became more of a missile-based aircraft, and that's how things are fought, the gunner position wasn't really as useful, but at least early on, it definitely was, because this was designed during really right after World War II, when the main way you'd fight is using machine guns and cannons. So they didn't really think of missiles back then. And even with the B-52, the North Vietnamese didn't have, well, they did have radar-guided missiles, but the jamming equipment on this bomber was actually pretty good. So they were able to jam most of the missiles. Unfortunately, and this is a little bit controversial, the mission planners flew the exact same missions every night with these bombers. They never even bothered to change the path or change the time even.
Flight patterns?
Yes, every day at like 8 o'clock, these things would be, they knew exactly where these were going to be. So all they had to do was just lob up a bunch of missiles around that time, and chances are that at least one of them would hit the bomber. So the missiles on this one, actually, the radar-guided missiles were actually jammed because this did have pretty good jamming equipment. But unfortunately, when there's just so much going up, eventually one's going to hit you. So that was the main problem these had. Occasionally you'd have fighters, but usually the fighters would stand off and relay the bomber's position down to the missile sites on the ground. So, you know, during Vietnam, it sort of transitioned away from dogfighting that you saw in Korea in World War II, but they still had them on there because they thought that they might have a role to play in defending the aircraft.
Yeah. Well, great work here. Thank you so much for bringing this out to the show and for spending time to take us through the whole model here. It looks great. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I appreciate you guys talking with me. Glad you could see it in person.